Finally tonight, as Valentine's Day fades into memory for another year, essayist Clarence Page reminds us of another Valentine's Day, one that has special meaning for the people who live in Chicago.
Sometimes a city is haunted by its past. Atlanta will never forget the Civil War. New Orleans will never forget its riverboat gamblers. When you think of Indianapolis, you think of the 500. What do you think of when you think of Chicago? Ah, yes. Other cities may have their distinctions, but Chicago is the only one that associates the Feast of St. Valentine with a massacre. They don't call the Thompson submachine gun a Chicago typewriter for nothing. When we Chicagoans visit other parts of the world and say we're from Chicago, we just know we're going to hear some reference to Al Capone. We like to think Chicago is more than that. Sure, we have gangsters, but no more than any other major city. Today, we Chicagoans praise our great symphony, our great art institute, our great writers like Nelson Algren, Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright, and Saul Bellow. Our great pizza, deep dish pizza, that's unique. Our Cubs, our Bears, our Mike Ditka. That's Chicago's present. Still, we're haunted by our past. It's part of our local folklore. It's part of us.
So you got a pistol on you? You come to Chicago, you didn't bring a pistol with you? Get on this bus for Christ's sake.
It's also a tourist attraction. You can sign up for the Untouchables tour and take this bus to famous sites of the Prohibition era. The Biograph Theater, where John Dillinger had his final date with the lady in red. And the alley down the street, where he died in a hail of FBI bullets.
Everybody stripped to the waist.
A combination safe house, boarding house, bordello, and speakeasy, where Capone housed some of his hitmen. And the passageway in the back, through which they escaped from the police. Maxwell Street Police Station, where some who didn't escape wound up. Our past sells itself.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Just ask Geraldo Rivera. When he cracked into Capone's vault in the old Lexington Hotel on national television, he didn't find anything, but he did win the biggest ratings any syndicated show ever had. Speaking of shows...
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tommy Gunn's Garage.
Tommy Gunn's Garage, an old-fashioned speakeasy only a block away from police headquarters. If you want to catch a little bit of the fantasy, this is the place. The speakeasies, the flappers, the scandal, the untouchables, the mob. Although we Chicagoans seem ambivalent about our gangster past, secretly we're proud of it. It's the pride of knowing that, yes, we are what Chicago poet Carl Sandburg called us, the city with big shoulders. It's the pride of the tough police sergeant in the Untouchables, who said to Elliot Ness,
"Want to get Capone? Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way."
Yeah, that's the Chicago way. A city is more than brass and steel. A city is a state of mind. Yeah, we're from Chicago. We handled Capone. We can handle anything. Don't call us the second city.
Hello, welcome to The Past is Prologue. The theme of this year's show is great villains. We're discussing not only the evil deeds of such infamous individuals as Adolf Hitler, but more important, why some people have been perceived as villains, in some cases wrongly, while the evil deeds of others have escaped censure. We'll be talking today about a man whose name has become synonymous with criminal activity, Al Capone. My guest is the department's distinguished professor of history, Edward Shapsmeyer. Ed is an authority on 20th century American history and is, if I recall correctly, the co-author with his brother of 7 books. It is a great pleasure to welcome Ed to the show.
It's a pleasure for me to be here, John.
Well, I guess we can probably assume, Ed, that more or less anybody who is listening to this show has heard of Al Capone. Perhaps we ought to begin by asking who he really was. I mean, how do you become a great criminal?
Well, Al Capone was born with the name of Alphonse Capone, but he hated that first name, and usually his friends called him Al or then Big Al, and then he got known as Scarface Al when he began to get some of the scars of warfare. He was the son of Gabriel and Teresa Capone, both who had immigrated from Naples in 1893. He was born in 1899 in Brooklyn in a poor section and would die in 1947, only 48 years of old. Al Capone went to public school, as far as we know, to about the 5th grade, and his closest boyhood chum was another criminal of the future, Salvatore Lucky Luciano. And as a teenager, he was already a member of a gang called 5 Points Gang, whose leader was Johnny Torrio, who's really sort of his teacher, and it will be Torrio who will have the greatest influence in his life.
I presume that his native language was really Italian, that he probably spoke Italian at home and in the neighborhood.
Yes, he did.
I wonder how good his English was. Any idea?
Kind of, when you think of, say, the Buddy Hackett type of English, a kind of a Brooklynese type, with a little adaptation to the Chicago South Side. But he spoke English, not what you wouldn't know that he was off the boat, but he spoke Italian all right.
I'm quite sure. Probably that is mother's language in this case. Well, we mentioned he came obviously from Brooklyn, but how does he get from Brooklyn to Chicago? How does Chicago get blessed with his stay in that city?
Well, it's this Johnny Torrio who headed this gang of kids. Torrio had already moved to Chicago and had got association with James Big Jim Colosimo, a real big-timer already, and he invited Al Capone to come to Chicago. Capone, by the way, at this time, which was 1919, was eager to do so because he had been working as a bartender bouncer in a club out on Coney Island and had gotten so rough that he had killed a person who was under indictment. So he took off and came to Chicago, and from here he would forever be linked with a gang of his own, and this would be after Colosimo and the others were sort of rubbed out.
Well, I guess one associates Al Capone mainly with bootlegging, obviously after Prohibition was established. How does he get into that kind of line of business?
At first, it appears that Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, when they set up their headquarters at what was called the Four Deuces in South Wabash Avenue in Chicago, it was really a tavern and a bordello. But when Prohibition came in, the amendment went into effect January 17, 1920, this opened up a whole new field for the criminals of that era and really, I think, made what we call big-time crime. Because all of a sudden, people could not buy beer and alcoholic beverages, and of course they wanted it, and Big Al and his colleagues here decided that's the type of business they would now go into. So their other business, which had been the brothels and the taverns, so on, was just cut down, and they all went into bootlegging. Either they bought or took stills and breweries from one another and really began this series of type of warfare that we associate with this bootlegging.
Well, how do they operate? I mean, do they manufacture their own booze? I mean, what?
They were such, really, in this sense, good businessmen. That's right. They practically emulated the brewing industry. They owned stills, plants that brewed beer, bottling plants, trucking, and all of this they organized and operated just as if it were a legitimate business. Now, since it was all illegal, and they sold through these speakeasies where you'd knock on a door and it'd open slide a little panel, and Joe sent me some key word, but they bribed police. In fact, it just broke down the Chicago police force almost totally. Officials, sometimes going as high as state Supreme Court justices, mayors. And in fact, one of the big areas at one point, Al Capone practically, literally took over Cicero, this little city or little town next to Chicago, and made it his headquarters for a long time.
Let me just ask you something. We have for today the problems of enforcing the anti-drug laws. But when you talk about smuggling drugs, they're obviously minute quantities. I mean, these are small, relatively small packages that can be smuggled in some way in a suitcase or something. We're talking about brewing. I mean, you're talking about vast plants to brew beer and things of this sort. I mean, how do you so openly, flagrantly break the law? Is it just bribery and just utter and complete corruption?
That'd be the only way, because, first of all, if you're brewing beer, you can smell that. I mean, you can smell a brewery nearby. As a kid, I worked in a Falstaff brewery. The malt and the stuff you can is heated up in these big tanks. You could smell. So it's quite obvious that it could not have existed without corruption and bribery. No way it could.
And I mean, you're importing vast quantities of grain and all the rest. I mean, it's just almost
that's right.
inconceivable.
And you have big trucks. You have trucks hauling up and unloading. Just enormous amount of. You cannot hide it. It isn't like secreting some cocaine in a sock or
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Briefcase and just getting on a plane. And no, you cannot hide this, particularly on the scale that they did it.
I mean, to supply a city the size of Chicago.
That's right. It wasn't just as if they were going to make 20 bottles and you're going to sneak it in somewhere. They were making it, by the barrels.
Did they take over the existing breweries? I mean, after all, there had been breweries. Did they just take those over and keep on manufacturing?
No, oddly enough, but they bought the equipment when the legal ones had to sell out. They just simply bought it. But most of them then made makeshift warehouses. I think they didn't want to establish in the same location where they had been before, lest the FBI, it was the federal that they were most afraid of. But here's another thing, that what we think of as the FBI, or they used to refer to as the G-men, the government men, really wasn't well organized in the 1920s. And bootlegging and men like Al Capone are really what gave the FBI the impetus and Congress the desire to make this a big organization. Before 1920, government G-men, so-called, weren't even armed. There was this fear of a state police, and they almost had no authority. And soon, here Al Capone and these men are using machine guns and killing each other in battles in the street, and so they had to arm the FBI. They began to use tap phones, the kind of covert. And it's really the FBI that will get Al Capone and wreck his bootlegging business, not the local police, which at one time is estimated that 90% of the police in Chicago were probably in on the take. They just simply ignored the speakeasies and the traffic going to and from the breweries.
You mentioned a little bit before that he was operating in Cicero, which is, I guess, a Chicago suburb of some sort, isn't it? What happened there? Why Cicero?
They wanted a headquarters, a place where, I guess, that would cut down the cost that they had to spend to bribe. And in 1924, there was a municipal election there in which Mayor Joseph Klena was up for re-election. Well, they had got to him, but it looked like a reform group was going to throw him out. And as Virgil Peterson wrote a book called Barbarians in Our Midst, and he called the 1924 election of Cicero, quote, one of the most disgraceful episodes in American municipal history. Something like 200 of Al Capone's men with machine guns, can you imagine, enter the polls all over the city and just stuff the boxes, shove voters out the street, kidnapped opponents. And then when the Cicero police and some from Chicago tried to drive them out, there was actually a gun battle in the street in which they killed a lot of policemen. And in this, Frank Capone, Al's brother, was actually killed in a gun battle. And they just literally took over the government of Cicero.
I come back, why Cicero? Is it an Italian town in any way? Is it a larger town, or is it just a working class area? What is it?
It was not particular. I think it was because what Al Capone was looking for was a neutral city that no one had, because Chicago was all carved up. South Side, North Side, Midway area, Des Plaines. I mean, these criminals had like fiefdoms. And what Capone wanted was an area in close where he could build more breweries, but not in Chicago, so he wouldn't get on someone else's turf. So he thought, why not grab a little town of my own, and this is ours. And once they got control of it, Capone's men all of a sudden became deputy sheriffs and you name it, they're all wearing badges, all legally carrying guns now. And of course, they just operated openly, but no one else could. And what began here was what were called the Great Beer Wars. The greed and the killing of one another is really what brought the greatest scorn on them and finally brought their downfall, is the fighting amongst themselves for this horrendous amount of money that was at stake here in bootlegging.
How was this kind of an organization run?
Well, Capone, despite the fact that he hadn't gone to school much and spoke poor English, was not stupid and seemed to have been a very good organizer. He had certain leaders of certain categories. A man in charge of his bootlegging was one of his brothers, Ralph. He had about 5 of them. Ralph Bottles Capone, he was nicknamed Bottles. The head of his gambling unit was Mike Heitler. His cousin, Charles Fischetti, was the link to the Sicilians. See, he was not a Sicilian, but he linked with them because the beginnings of what we now call the mafia, or they called the mafiosa, was beginning, and he wanted the Sicilians on his side. Well, that man was Frank the Enforcer Nitti, another one of these well-known gangsters. Then he had crews that would hijack the trucks of other bootleggers, and this was headed by Jim Calistromi, called the Bomber of the Breweries. And then Phil Andrea headed his bodyguard, and he had something like 50 of them. When he would move outside of his headquarters in Cicero, or would move in, down in Chicago, go to a restaurant, they'd be about 5 deep all around him because everyone was shooting at everybody else. And one of his bodyguards was called Samuel Golf Bag Hunt because he carried his machine gun in a golf bag all the time, just had it all ready to go. Then he had what they dubbed as torpedoes or hitmen, Anthony Arcado, Sam Giacono. Some of these names are quite familiar. And one guy called Jack Machine Gun McGurn, who evidently had gotten the reputation for one of the first ones to use a Thompson machine gun, which was World War I stuff. So it was just like armies, like an army.
There's something perhaps we ought to clarify. You pointed out that he was not a member of the mafia. I mean, we tend to associate this kind of criminal activity with the mafia, but you have to be Sicilian to be a mafia member.
In this era, I don't know how it operates today, but back in the era of the 20s and 30s, the Italians tended to congregate. If you're from Naples, you were Neapolitan, and the Sicilians had the mafia. And Lucky Luciano in New York City, who stayed there, who was a buddy of Al Capone, he seemed to have been linked from the very beginning with the mafia, with the Sicilians. And obviously was one. Remember in World War II, when he was deported in Sicily, he actually helped the OSS fight the Nazis because he knew a lot of the ins and outs and probably knew warfare about as good from his American days. But Al Capone never was. And he made overtures to them, but sometimes his gang, when their territories, and he encroached, they got in fights, and so sometimes Sicilians were killed, and so he was not always in good favor with the Sicilians.
One of the things that I noticed when you read the names of his gangsters, they're mainly Italians, but not all of them. I mean, they're not all. I mean, it's not a purely Italian gang, from what I can see from the names, just judging by the names. Is that correct?
Oddly enough, for instance, that Jack McGurn,
exactly.
His real name was Donora, so he was Italian.
Oh, so he was Italian.
And why someone would change their name, the only thing I could think of is that in Chicago, one of the chief rivals of the Capone gang on the north side, see, they had the south side, and then these little fiefdoms scattered all over, was Dion O'Banion, who was Irish, and his buddy was George Bugs Moran. I mean, these were the two real great enemies of Al Capone. In fact, I mean, these groups shot at each other and tried to kill Capone, and he tried to kill them repeatedly. Now, whether this Jack McGurn took an Irish name, thinking, well, try to get neutral in this thing, I don't know. But it's quite obvious that the gangsters in Chicago were Irish, Italian predominantly at this time. At least they associated, and they tend to hire people of their own ethnic group. I'm sure it broadened out and there were non-Irish or Italians amongst these, but predominantly they seem to have this ethnic unity.
Okay, because I was struck by the...
Probably for their protection. Yeah. They felt safe with their own.
And I wonder if they spoke
kind.
Italian or English among themselves.
I really don't know how much they conversed, but one thing that this one group, I forget, the Genna brothers, which were Sicilian, they were, when they would go on ventures, they always went by a church and they'd all go in and say prayers. They were called the religious ones, but that's about as close to any religiosity than any of these people ever got.
So the chief rival, what is it, the Moran gang? Is that the...
Yeah, there's O'Banion and Bugs Moran on the north side. I mean, they literally just ended up shooting it out. In fact, Moran was the one in the Valentine's Day massacre that Al Capone was actually trying to get.
Why don't you tell us about that? I mean, exactly who is getting whom and what are they up to and what's that all about?
Well, the beer war from 1924 to 1929, there was something like 60 gangland murders. None of them ever solved. I mean, you just find someone shot up on the street. And Al Capone tried to stop it. He realized that, okay, why don't we just draw a division and you take the north and I get all the rest. By this time, he had encroached on practically everything else, and the others had given in. But Bugs Moran particularly was a very stubborn, and because so many of his men had already been killed, he simply wouldn't capitulate. Because what Al Capone did is had Johnny Torrio come back from Italy. Torrio had retired about 1925. He had gotten shot at. The pellets of a shotgun blast that went through his jaw and his arm, and he was rich, so he figured, who wants this? And he went back to Italy. Well, he came back and presided over a big, meeting of the big gangsters, a peace conference. It was in Atlantic City. Lucky Luciano was there and everything. But the only one who wouldn't show up was Bugs Moran, which was, of course, and it was at this time that Capone, in effect, declared war and said, well, if he doesn't want peace, then we're going to rub him out and his whole gang. And it was on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1929, when two gunmen that Capone had hired, Scalise and Anselmi, they dressed their group as policemen. In a police car, and they went up to these cars with Bugs Moran's men, and they thought he was among them. But oddly enough, about 2 minutes before, he had gone in to get some cigarettes or something and wasn't there. And they arrested them as if they were policemen, took them in empty warehouse, 7 of them, and just lined them up with a machine gun and just shot them. Shot everyone. Now, Al, of course, was at his big mansion in Florida because he could visibly show that he was not present. But what's ironic, really, which shows there's no honor amongst thieves, is that these two gunmen, Scalise and Anselmi, who were Sicilians and had worked for this Genna gang and had seemingly gone to Al Capone, at least according to Al, he thought they were really going to double-cross him and shoot him because he held a banquet for them about 6 months later, and you wouldn't believe it, but he took a baseball bat and beat both of them to death in front of the rest of his men for their alleged treason. That shows you how cruel, and really, these guys were terrible, no honor amongst themselves at all. I mean, whether this was true that these two were double-crossing, I don't know, but that was their reward, to literally get killed by him, by his own hand. Oddly enough, he never did get Bugs Moran murdered, but twice Moran almost got Al Capone. Bugs Moran, I gather, was the inventor of the style of assassination of having about 5 or 6 cars, a motorcade, all with like 4 men in each one had a machine gun. And at this restaurant where Al Capone went to, now when Al went to a restaurant, he bought out all the chairs, all the tables, and all his men were in, and he'd be in the middle. But Moran thought, with wave after wave of cars with machine guns that they bound to get him. Well, they killed a lot of them, but oddly enough, not him. And twice they did that to Capone.
I remember seeing this on a movie, late night movie, when they showed this scene.
The motorcade assassination thing, that was Bugs Moran's big thing.
Well, let me ask you.
And so there'd be, like if there were people in the way, that's just tough. people in the streets, they just got shot.
I referred to the movie. To what extent, how does the public react to this kind of outrageous misbehavior?
It's really, I don't know, it's not funny, but it's ironic that Al Capone was kind of regarded as a folk hero. Same way that Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly. I don't know whether it was the Depression. Now, Capone did a lot to build his image amongst the poor people.
But this is pre-Depression. This is the 20s.
Yeah, but remember, there were recession and hard times then too, but he ran a soup kitchen for 15 years. Anybody could come in and get food. In other words, he tried to create the image that he's a Robin Hood, that he really wasn't hurting anybody. In fact, his famous statement is, "I give the public what it wants." He never, thought bootlegging was wrong. After all, they wanted it. And if you think of it, in a way, of course, bootlegging wouldn't exist if the public would have obeyed the law. But nevertheless, this killing, this ruthless, and he was, amongst all the professional gangsters of the time, like Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, they were known as at least rational, but Al Capone could get angry and lose his temper, as when he beat these two men up, killed them. And thus, he was just so insistent that he was going to get Bugs Moran that these murders just went on. And the people finally got tired of it because simply Chicago was unsafe. Even Luciano once made the statement, the streets of Chicago ain't safe. Here's a gangster saying that. But oddly enough, it's not public opinion that finally did him in. It would be the Internal Revenue Service.
Before we get to that, let me just ask you another question about Al Capone, to try to get at this man's personality. There's always this image of the mafia leaders who engage in all of this mayhem, kill each other off, but then have a happy family life, the wife and the children, and somehow the wife and the children are beyond these kind of gangland killings. You never touch the wife or the children. Is Capone married? Is he a father with children? I mean, is this part of it?
He was married, but he had no children. His wife was May Coughlin, obviously from the name sounds Irish, of Brooklyn. In this era, as far as I could, that is, I'm talking 1920s, 1930s, they didn't seem to touch each other's families or wives.
That seems to be the rule even to this day. Yeah.
I mean, once in a while today, you throw a bomb in the guy's living room, you have to kill his wife, kids, but they don't seem to go out after the wife. They're kind of, in a strange way, family-oriented, and they do leave the feminine sector out, seemingly. So there's never indication of, but relatives, brothers, and so on, they were.
But they're part of the business.
Yes, all open season.
I just keep wondering what Mrs. Al Capone was like. I mean, he comes home from a hard day's work.
Not much written about it. When he ultimately went to prison, she just sort of disappeared from public view.
Well, you mentioned that in the end it's the IRS that gets him. How does the IRS get him at the end?
Finally, well, obviously, Al Capone, these are from the court proceedings that the Internal Revenue Service initiated, but it was estimated that in the last 10 years prior to 1931, when he was indicted and convicted, that his income was $60 million, and he had never paid any income tax.
$60 million over the whole period?
That's right.
Okay.
$60 million, just him. This is not paying out his gang and the gross, but the net for him.
This is net income.
Well, of course, the FBI had already been wrecking his breweries, but they could never actually link it to him because he always had Confederates and someone else took the rap, and then he'd get lawyers and delay it or just take them out of jails. But in 1931, what they did is for about 2 years just kept a record of things that he bought, stores that he went to, like he had 5 Cadillacs. Pretty soon you can establish a record that you've got to have an income to buy this kind of thing.
If you don't pay taxes on it.
And you can't have a mansion in Florida and all that kind of thing and have all these hired people without some income. And so in 1931, he was tried and convicted by a jury trial. And of course they had to protect the jury because that was one of the fears that they would either bribe them or kill them. But they did get him convicted, and he was fined $50,000. But more important, he was given an 11-year prison sentence. Now, obviously with a bevy of lawyers, he appealed it, and so he was in Cook County Jail. Well, in Cook County Jail, it was just like his home. I mean, he had like Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz visit him, and he had anything he wanted. But what really did him in is in 1934, he was sent to Alcatraz when it just opened up. He was prison number 85, cell block B, laundry room detail. And that's what prisons call hard time, because you go in there and there's no way out. There's no escape, no privileges, silence. Prisoners couldn't even talk to one another. And now, what happened is that he had syphilis, and he began to deteriorate mentally. And so finally, even before his prison sentence was actually up, in 1939, he was transferred to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where he was paroled to his wife. And as one of his inmates had called him nutty as a fruitcake, by this time he was simply just not with it. And he ended up dying in January of 1947.
So he does live quite a while after his release.
Of a brain hemorrhage as a complication of this physical dilemma. Likewise, he had pneumonia and so on.
Does he have money left at this time, or does he spend it just as fast as he makes it, or does he leave a tidy sum behind?
Well, it's funny. You'd think that a person with a gang like he had would have been able to keep some control, and when Al gets out, he's going to take back over. Well, first of all, evidently the word that he was physically and mentally deteriorating leaked out, but even before it was apparent, there were attempts to kill him in Alcatraz, 2 of them. Once he got stabbed with a homemade blade in the back, and another time a group beat him up, but he was so strong that he got away. So it's quite obvious that others wanted to take over the remnants of the mob, and he was simply out of the way, and they were going to kill him. And what's ironic, when he obviously had some money stashed away, because his wife, when she took charge of him, really, because he was incapable, they had a modest home in Florida, not the big mansion anymore, and she had no outside source of income, but obviously he had stashed away, but not millions. He did not live ostentatiously from there on out.
So the money was gone.
The money was gone, yeah.
Briefly, what's the legacy of Al Capone?
Well, I think it establishes one thing, that Prohibition was that noble experiment that really gave birth to big crime. It allowed criminals to make huge sums, which then they could invest in legitimate business. And oddly enough, I think the today restricting marijuana, so on, although it's a different thing, and you've got a drug which has different effect, the same thing's happening. It's making millionaires, billionaires probably out of some, because if the people want it, okay, so on, they're going to get it, and somebody will deliver it. And you have a repetition of that, and how that's to be solved is... It also left Chicago with a terrible reputation, which kind of still exists. You visit Europe, and obviously you're from Chicago or something, and
they immediately associate you with Al Capone.
Because they see these old movies, and they wonder, anybody been shot in the street today? They think it's just part of the regular day life of Chicago.
People are always trying to draw lessons from history, Ed. Obviously, the solution, in part, to bootlegging and all of this was to legalize again alcohol, to give up on prohibition. Is the solution to the drug problem to legalize drugs?
Well, that's a little.
I know that's a tough question. I mean,
yeah, it really is. See, even if you take, say, what could be called the least of the drugs, say marijuana, okay, you're going to let them make it in packages like cigarettes. Well, where are they going to sell it? In machines? They're going to sell it over the counter? Well, you can't even keep a 10-year-old kid from getting a pack of cigarettes now, because he can just get it. So, I don't know. But the other side of the coin is that the type of crime. Well, see, Miami's getting the reputation like Chicago. I mean, they're killing each other, and this is a billion-dollar affair, and they take over almost the country of Colombia. Almost been taken over by the gangsters. So. I don't know. This is somewhere I could tell you as a historian what has happened, but I can't solve the future.
This is one case where history maybe doesn't give us any easy solutions. Well, thank you, Ed, for being on the show.